Okay, hello. Am I live? Can I get a reaction on? I don't know if I'm live or not. I'm gonna check. Am Sorry, I'm trying to figure out. I guess we can't share screen, so I will have to go through the presentation. Um, okay, yeah, that's confirmed. Okay, so good evening, everybody. First of all, I want to thank the current PDU administration for doing this series. I think it's really helpful. Obviously, I've been out of debate for quite some time, so uh, I would say I will probably be providing this lecture from a very rusty point of view. I guess in a way, it's mostly just information sharing and than anything else. So yeah, that's it. So yeah, by the way, my name is Giano. I used to debate competitively for Xavier University a long time ago. Um, and I've been given the topic of international relations. But for this evening, I will be very specific with what I will be sharing. I hope the slide link is there below. You should check it out. Um, it's not a very slide dependent presentation, I would say. So I'm going to do this with a lot of ad libs. So try not to, I mean, this slide is a guide, but try not to be too fixated on the presentation. Um, so right, for this specific evening, I will be talking about protracted crisis insofar as international relations is concerned. I'm looking at this from the perspective of looking at trends and how they impact society, and I hope that after the lecture, I suppose people can get information out of it, maybe use it in debates. But more importantly, I think the whole goal is just make everybody as informed as possible as to what some of the problems to the world are aside from COVID. So yeah, keep safe, stay at home. So I can go to the next slide, which is overview. Um, so when I look at international relations debate back when I was still actively debating and really getting into the preparation of it, I would never consider myself as an expert in IR debates. I would say I am an avid fan of history and a keen observer of world affairs and foreign policy in general. I think I'm interested in, from a perspective of I observe it and I see certain trends going on and I find that fascinating. Uh, but I don't have an IR background. Like I've never done this as a formal point of study. I've read books about international relations, Francis Fukuyama and all such, but these are just from a point of interest, not necessarily from a scholarly perspective. So don't expect me to throw in some theories in this presentation. It's not going to be like using the realist theory perspective. I think in general, the way I look at international relations is I look at it as from the perspective of states being rational. They have motivations. They react to certain things. They have principles. Even the most despicable authoritarian state is not purely built on just desire for greed or power. Most of them are desired on an agenda or on a belief or a philosophy that they are right. So that's how I look at IR. For this specific topic, I would say though that I guess my contribution would be pretty much on the perspective of as a professionally as somebody who's been in the field, seeing foreign policies being affecting certain communities, especially crises and conflict. So I think I hope that after the presentation you'll be hopefully get something out from that based from that perspective. So the way I think I will do this in the shortest amount of time possible is I'm going to go through a bit of definition, obviously, just so that we can level off our expectations, what I understand, and hopefully you'll be able to understand as well. I'm going to look at two case studies. mostly because I think these case studies are relevant in the specific topic that I want to sort of really zone in on. But at the same time, I think they represent some of the more disturbing trends of conflict that we see um, in the 21st century. And then last but not the least, I'll try to do motion analysis. I don't think I'll be super comprehensive in motion analysis. I think I'll just try to unpack motions that I think fit into the presentation, and hopefully you'll get an understanding of my thought process and how I see those debates and how I think you can see those debates as well. Okay, so third slide. Just basically grab some snippet from a speech from Peter Moore, president of the ICRC. If you don't know the ICRC, it is an international organization tasked on basically having this sole mandate of of observing and being a neutral element in conflicts around the world. So you'll see them in the most complicated of situations, Syria, for example, or the Iraq War. He's saying in some of his speeches about this whole concept of a new normal is that we are seeing some concerning trends converging: violence, terrorism, underdevelopment, injustice, exclusion, and the impact of climate change. What he considers as a perfect storm. And that leads me to this overall topic, which is protracted crisis. The reason why I think I picked this topic is that I think conflict has evolved um, after World War II, and what we're seeing right now is a far more uh, disturbing element of conflict arising in many different parts of the world, only because it's very hard to be able to identify when they end. And I mean, you can see where they begin, but it's very hard to identify when they end, and I think that poses a significant problem um, for traditional methods of dealing with the situation. I'll get to that thought in a bit. Which leads me to this first bit, right? Defining international armed conflict. And I want to use the 1949 Geneva Conventions. It's defined two ways. First one is international armed conflict between two or more opposing states. So just to be simplistic about it, you know, a nation state, a country fights against another country. The United States versus Germany in World War II, the Allied and the Axis powers. That is what we would call as a formal form of international conflict, armed conflict, in a sense that formal armies are deployed. You've got troops and you've got exchanges. The other definition under the Geneva Conventions is non-international armed conflict. So this is conflict that happens within the state. So it's between governmental forces, you know, forces inside the state that are identified as government but don't necessarily belong to the same political faction. Coup d'états are formal examples. You've seen that in the history of the Philippines many times. Um, there are also non-governmental armed groups. So you formally call this as non-state armed actors. Um, and those are also identified and recognized by the Geneva Conventions. Um, Not to belabor this slide too long, it's just really the formal definition of what we consider as conflict. So anything that occurs internationally between two countries or more, that is international armed conflict. Anything that occurs within a country, but still involves formal troops, formal forces, identified by uniform, by creed, by philosophy. That's non-international armed conflict. That's recognized by the Geneva Conventions. However, on the next slide, you'll see a question I posed: is the Geneva Conventions of 1949 outdated? I'm not in the position to say it is, but there are many scholars you can read up on them that the world after World War II has changed. It's very different. It's not the same anymore. There's been a slow introduction of less state-related armed groups. So you can see, for example, in the Philippines, we've been um, having one of the longest, I guess, insurgency in the Bangsamoro. Also, with the Communist Party of the Philippines, and overseas as well. Like in Myanmar, for example, you've got many ethnic related armed groups, like the groups in Chin State, the Rakhine Army, so all of that. In other parts of the world, you have that as well. So in a sense, you can say we've reached a point of our world history where we've seen less involvement of huge organized military action. Country versus country, the same thing that you would say what happened in World War II, and maybe to a certain consequence, what happened in the Cold War preceding after that. But it doesn't mean that conflict has ceased. It's just gone more local. It's gone more uh, indigenous in many sense. And also, you can also say that some of the oppression has come from state actors as well. So before, when the Geneva Conventions was made, it was a byproduct of uh, governments after World War II seeing the destruction that it caused, saying, "Oh, we need to be able to govern future wars. We need to be able to make sure that damage that's done in these wars is not led to excessive extents, that it dehumanizes the individual. We can't see opposing soldiers as less than human beings. We need to treat them with certain respects. That's why you have like the prisoners of war agreements. If a soldier surrenders, then they're not executed on the spot. Um, there are rules that govern that. But when it comes to internal domestic conflicts, some of these perspectives are no longer as cut and dry as we thought they are. Also, there are also what we call as invisible wars being fought. For anybody following the drone strikes that happened during the Obama administration under the United States, most of these were done, beyond specific territories. Like a U.S. air base that's stationed in Afghanistan launches a drone, strikes at Al Qaeda targets that are in Yemen. Do they still are they still covered under the Geneva Conventions? Obviously, there's like lots of scholarly work that are trying to take on that, but that is a challenge to the original framework. I think when our perceptions of war and conflict were being honed in during that period of time, it was mostly because we were thinking the future war, the World War III, will mostly be a war fought by the same sort of formal armies. But the reality is that it's just gone more, local, smaller, armed resistance fighting. And obviously, it's also always political. Conflicts are always motivated by certain degree of politics. So it goes hand in hand. You have an armed force, but you also have a political struggle that goes with it. It's not a war for resources alone. It's also, for power, for philosophy, for specific visions of leadership and governance. And last but not the least, I guess you could say, the definition of unconventional war, terroristic acts have also been introduced slowly. It doesn't mean that they haven't happened before. I think they were, like, for example, in World War II, napalm strikes, chemical warfare was probably used to some extent. But after that, there was a reaction to sort of govern that, and we've had laws in place to discourage or even make it ethically wrong for countries to commit to that type of warfare. But the new players, the forces that have emerged in the last 20, 30 years don't seem to play by the same rules. And at the same time, this evolution has also made it allowable for certain nation states to use those gaps and say, "Oh, that is a terrorist act. Like, I consider you as a terrorist group." Like a good example would be before we entered to formal agreements with the BIRMM, which is backed up by their armed resistance under the MILF. At some point in time during the last 10 years, especially during the Estrada administration of the Philippine government, we were close to declaring the MILF as a terrorist group and any linkages to them. So in some way, today's terrorists may not be the same. I mean, it goes back to the same um, sort of a cliche that your terrorist is my freedom fighter. So that gray area is significant in the way we look at conflict today. So moving on to the seventh slide, I'm basically going to look at two case studies that I think are critical in understanding protracted conflict. And I think when I say protracted conflict, it's basically how conflict exists in a situation where you think it would end, but it doesn't. So by definition, it's really about conflicts that don't seem to end or have no ending. And South Sudan and Myanmar are kind of within that sphere of gray area, where you have some degree of armed elements, identifiable armed elements, but at the same time they don't seem to be able to end up with a resolution compared to formal armed conflicts that have happened in the past. So let's look at South Sudan. At this point, I'm just going to go through a timeline. I think it's the timeline is important because it allows us to get a sense of how things started and how they're not ending. So the civil war in South Sudan erupted in 2013 of December formally, but before that, South Sudan was the world's youngest country. Basically, there was so much joy and welcoming by this new democratic nation in East Africa after 20 years of war against Sudan. So before there was a united Sudan that was sort of divided both ethnically um, between the Arab Sudanese um, and the sort of Christian uh, Dinkas, Nuers of the South. And after 20 years, the South was given liberation after much struggle and bloodshed. So they became the world's youngest country. They declared independence, and obviously they were able to establish a new government. Under this government, there were two revolutionary leaders, and they sort of play a significant part in why this crisis has gone on for so long. You had Salva Kiir, um, and you had Riek Machar, two very interesting and polarizing figures of the revolution of their revolution, sworn into the two highest positions in office. Sadly, that new government and that new sort of um, position was not a happy marriage. They encountered a lot of rough patches in the earlier years, despite the enthusiasm for this new country. Sudan is also very oil rich to some extent, so it had potential. But in 2013, after so much political squabbling between the two leaders, Salva Kiir, the president, then fired Riek Machar along with the other ministers that belonged under Riek Machar's sort of loyalty cabinet. And then in the 16th of December, the capital of South Sudan, Juba, descended into civil war. So civil war in a sense that this was not an invasion force. This is basically a fight between forces that were loyal to the president and forces that were loyal to the vice president. So it really in a sense it's about a political battle between two forces, and they they definitely had sort of reasons for themselves why they wanted that position. So that descended the whole country into conflict for the next 7 years or so. Um, there were sort of you would say as a peaks and moments of conflict. So when I say civil war and when I say forces that were loyal to each side, it was split ethnically to some extent. So you had the ethnic backings of Salva Kiir. He was Nuer. I mean, no, he was Dinka. So you could research on that. Um, but you could also look at Salva Kiir's history. He was also Nuer. And I guess I would spend like an hour or so just trying to describe the the ethnic component, but that became a theme of how people divided themselves into the country and forces that were loyal. So you could see how it becomes more complicated because it's not just a power struggle. There's also an ethnic component about that as well. I'll make sense of that in the next slide, but hang on to that thought for a while. So in 2016, there was a lull of sorts. It reached to a point. I mean, conflicts are like this. Protracted conflicts are like this. It's they're not a they're not a sort of like if you have to graph them, conflict starts really high, but it doesn't stay that way. Obviously, at some point they run out of bullets. They also run out of people to kill. I'm not making fun of that. It's really sad, but it's not all the time war. At some point in time, you'll see pockets of opportunities to strike peace agreements. So you had that in 2016. They signed a very, very thin uh, peace agreement, but that was reversed immediately, short of 6 months, and fighting broke up again in the capital. And fast forward to 4 years in February 2020, we now come into the point where South Sudan has a more definitive power sharing agreement between the two leaders, but the situation still remains fragile. So you do have a quasi functioning government. They're now both leaders are now both in Juba, but because of how the conflict has evolved, there are now new players. So it's no longer about forces that were loyal to a specific actor and loyal to a specific ethnic group, but you've had splinter forces as well. Uh, you would consider them as maybe very similar to warlords, for example, that control territories and are not happy with the existing power sharing arrangement after 2020. So the way I would make sense about it, and you could go to slide 9, is I've sort of made a very simplified protracted crisis diagram. And the way protracted crises happen is that it's mostly internal. It's not to say that there are no protracted crises overseas. I think there are certain extents of protracted crises that happen overseas, but most of the problem really starts internally. You can go to examples like Syria. It's a civil war as well. South Sudan is also a civil war. Many parts of the world that have seen conflict exist for more than 10 years. They're mostly internal. And when you break down the components of the internal conflict, you'll see many factors. But from my point of view, I basically just narrowed it down to three factors. One is you have an institutional enabler. The second is that you have a community enabler, and the third factor is how much international support is put in to respond to this crisis. So many of these crises are not unknown to the international community. There's formal aid operations that happen on the ground, formal assistance being handed out to serve refugees, to serve displaced individuals that have been affected by conflict, civilians that are not party to the conflict. But their form of support, as I'll explain later on, is not entirely fit what this crisis really needs. So when I talk about the first pillar, which is institutional enablers, you basically look at what is the factor that enables um, the conduct of violence in this specific crisis. So in the case study of South Sudan, you have the army as the enabler, obviously, but not just the army as a monolithic group, but you have an army that is divided by loyalty and also divided by interest. You know, and one of the most salient features that I would consider, having worked with um, peacekeeping operations in South Sudan, is that the army there is not very well trained across the board. I mean, they will have some elite units, but not all of them are have institutional training. And institutional training is is really crucial because it allows for leaders to be able to control how their armies behave in battle or in the way they're deployed on the ground. So if you have an institutional enabler in an army that is uh, very disorganized, has a lot of split interests, then you're not able to seize military operations as quickly as you can. So if you compare this, for example, to a formal combat between the forces of Germany or the forces of the United States, assuming that, conflict happens between both formal armies right now, at any point in time wherein the generals say there's a ceasefire, we need to stop, it would probably take less than 8 hours for that command to trickle down from the head down to the foot soldier. In the case of South Sudan, you don't have that uniformity. You will have certain generals who will, um, depending on their point of interest, say we will not honor that command, even from as powerful a figure as the president or the vice president, even on situations of allegiance. It also means that from an institutional point of view, it is an enabler because it makes any kind of peace agreement that they sign very fragile. Because if one party, one combination of the army that you call as the opposition, suddenly feel their captain feels, I'm not happy with this agreement, I'm out, they take away not just their armed force but the territory that they control. So you may have some relevant peace between the forces that are within the control of the negotiating party, but you will not have peace for territories that don't see that command or respect that authority. So having that institutional element is really crucial when you look at protracted crisis, and a lot of these protracted crises have that element. And I guess from a debate perspective, when you're reading on civil wars, when you're reading on on wars that are happening across the world, look for those elements. Look for factors that when they say, "Oh, the army did this attack," try to trace up, is this an army that was ordered by the direct authority, the head general, or was it a warlord, or was it a splinter group? So all of that are sort of indicators that mean that we have an institutional um, uh, there's a fragile condition of on institutional control. The second component is a community enabler, and when I talk about community enablers, I look at um, ethnic conditions, or conditions that would make it possible for ethnic division to be used as fuel to the conflict. It's not to say that in many of these places ethnic conflict doesn't exist. They do. They always do. Even in a peaceful um, environment, relatively peaceful environment such as ours, wherein we don't have formal hate speech, there is some degree of division, whether it's through regional lines, whether it's through ethnic lines, whether it's through language, ethno-linguistic languages, there's division. But in protracted crisis environments, that division is used politically to back up the violence. So in the case of South Sudan, you have the vice president belonging to the second largest ethnic minority, and you have the president belonging to the largest ethnic majority, and you have certain historical disagreements between both of them, and in years past maybe some of them did harm to the other, and those are being used as fuel to the fight, because the fight can't the way the conflict survives is not just through you know, rallying the troops. A lot of the sparks and a lot of the damage is also done by people, communities that coexisted for many years, neighbors that suddenly see themselves as opposing ends of that ethnic conflict, and they no longer see themselves, in the same way that they did before, because they're being used as logs for the fire of hatred and xenophobia and racism and hate speech. So you have that factor in South Sudan. You had that ethnic division, and those are carved even into finer granular ethnicities, because South Sudan has a lot of ethnic minorities as well. So in a sense, most of them are forced to either choose one bigger side, right? So in the case of South Sudan, some of the smaller ethnic minorities who didn't see fair treatment with the current majority under the president sought to align themselves with the minority troops, seeing that they could find more liberation. But obviously, those agreements don't end up in the way that they imagine it to be. No agreement is ever beneficial to everybody, but in a sense, that community enabler is present. You see that in other cases as well. The case of Syria, where you have Assad and the opposition, and divisions between Sunni and Shia as well. So South Sudan is an extremely um, interesting dynamic when it comes to community violence and how that sort of augments the institutional conflict between the armies, but at the same time, the institutional conflict of the army also has an effect on the community as well. Which moves me to the third bit, the international support. And in a sense, I would say a lot of the protracted crisis that we see across the world right now, in a sense, the international support is very wanting. It's not to the point wherein we see anybody significantly changing the tone of conflict. A lot of it is responding to immediate needs, which is fine. Obviously, you have people that are displaced, and you have the international community coming in with aid to support them. But none of them really have a distinct solution to address the two other pillars. So that's where international support, I think, also falls in. How much force does the international community go in to these protracted crises to alter the landscape, to change the tone, to change the narrative, and either determine one winning side, or in this case on South Sudan, I would say the, their in, their passivity, their inability to decide who they're going to be backing as a community has also made it in a point where you have stalemates. You don't have a winning side, so you basically just have a perpetual battle between two forces that are using civilians and putting them at risk. So you have that diagram, you have that sort of evil triangulation of forces that make it really, really complicated. So I would say that that's how I would look at protracted crisis. I hope that sort of is understandable, but don't fret. I still have one more case study that sort of grounds that even further. So we move on to the 10th slide. Scale and focus. This is just a factoid that I guess some of you who are listening might want to take. In the case of South Sudan, you had 1.6 million South Sudanese IDPs. I'm referring to internally displaced persons. These are people that are displaced within their borders of their country. They can't go out, but they also can't go back to their places of origin. So if you want to imagine it, basically you live in Manila, but because of a calamity or a conflict, you're forced out of Manila and you're now living in somewhere in Batangas, for example. You are probably an IDP. Or in the case of Marawi, for example, a lot of people live right now, IDPs that we have in Marawi City, who live in a specific zone in an area in the city, but because of the siege that happened, are no longer living there, but they're living in neighboring provinces and local governments. So that's an IDP, and you can imagine that the figure 1.6 million. This is a lot of people. This is probably the population of a big city. So one huge city out inside their own country, not having a place to call their own. Um, and to add up to that figure, you have 2.3 million refugees scattered over neighboring countries. So you have displacement internally, but you also have people that have been, you know, forced to flee even outside the borders. So they become refugees. And just maybe as a tidbit, I guess this is like a usual spiel that I usually did before when I was working. Um, IDPs and refugees. All refugees are IDPs, but not all IDPs are refugees. If you want to take that delineation, a refugee is somebody that is outside their border, but an IDP is within the border. And for I guess for the context of violence, um, for the 7.4 million across the globe that's been displaced. Most of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. So places like Somalia, places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, even places in some parts in Sudan, a large part of South Sudan. A lot of the displacement that's happening, and you can see very very similar features to the conflicts that they have as well. If you want to read up more on them, there's a reason why 7.4 million people are displaced there. So let's move on to the second case study, Myanmar, and specifically for the Rohingya. The Rohingya are, I guess, if nobody has already known it, they are a ethnic minority group that hails their origins from Rakhine region in Myanmar, and they are basically the largest stateless group in the world, and their crisis started as early as 2012. So even before the South Sudan civil war, something happened in Myanmar that led to this crisis. And it's particular with Myanmar because it's not really a civil war, but it has a lot of shared elements that I'll show later on why this is also a protracted crisis. So in 2012, there was violent unrest in Western Rakhine. 150,000 Rohingya fled, basically went outside of Western Rakhine, went to neighboring Bangladesh. So if you can imagine the map, um, Bangladesh, Rakhine is on the top westmost part, and the top border is Bangladesh. People from that region went to Bangladesh after the violence in 2012. This violence was very ethnic, and religious driven. Um, the Rohingya, most of them, if not all of them, are Muslim minorities, so they practice Islam. Whereas the identified uh, perpetrators of the violence were Buddhist nationalists. So nothing, no specific person, but a group or a movement that believed in uh, extreme practices of Buddhism, but also extreme practices of nationalism. So their identifier, the way they identify themselves as a nation, is through religion and through ethnicity. So they considered the Rohingya not only as opposed to them in a sense that they think they don't belong to Rakhine State, but also that they practice a religion that they don't like. So that intercommunal violence sparked in 2012 led to the fleeing of 150,000 Rohingyas across the border. In 2014, there was a nationwide census that happened in Myanmar, and the Rohingya were excluded. So you could see that the elements of discrimination against the Rohingya were not just imposed by communities, but in some way and in some form, the state itself acknowledged this sort of systematic discrimination by also not recognizing the Rohingya as citizens. And even before this, there were already ongoing um, discussions as to whether or not Rohingya are really part of Myanmar or not part of Myanmar, and that sort of like is a pervasive, ongoing conversation that's happening in Myanmar as well. In 2015 to 2016, you had obviously the Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi winning the seat, taking into an uncomfortable power sharing deal agreement with the military government and forming the civilian government. Myanmar is probably one of the few places in the world where you have a two-system government. I would say, but don't take my word for it. This is just the reading when I was working there. Um, the civilian government controls the administrative aspects of government, but the military still controls large parts of security arrangements and also the logistics of the country. So you can see how that there's also some kind of like dynamics between both of them, and in a sense leads to some discussions as to why the NLD, the national uh, the National League of Democracy in Myanmar cannot uh, aggressively pursue more ethnically diverse policies. But you also have to also ask yourself: is Aung San Suu Kyi really in favor of um, acknowledging the Rohingya as a minority? I think that cares for further reading. But in general, they won. They were supposed to promise, or they won on the promise of delivering more equitable policies for all ethnic minorities in Myanmar. But fast forward to today, they still haven't been able to lead up to that. More so in the case of the Rohingya, which is why in 2016, at the end of 2016, the Rohingya insurgent group, the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, which wants to establish a sort of like an Islamic state in Rakhine for the Rohingya, claimed responsibility for a few border attacks, and that incident was used by the military government to enact security arrangements and measures in Rakhine, which led to the very horrible accounts of burning of villages in 2017. So I'm sure you've seen that in an article that was done by Reuters. You know, that had two journalists being jailed because they exposed the horrible what they would consider as genocide that happened in 2017. So the military began from August to October. The military began clearing operations, and as a consequence, those clearing operations forced exited further 600,000 Rohingya refugees to flee the border of Bangladesh. So in 2012, you were only looking at 150,000, which is not a small number, by the way. But in 2017, you had a massive exodus, and you had this incredible, powerful image of people, you know, wading through rice paddies across the borders of Bangladesh, going to another country that they never really called their own, and seeking refuge there. And after that exodus, you had 2018, the United Nations, Myanmar, and Bangladesh announcing a deal for repatriation because there were efforts to make them agree with each other. But up until this point, there's been no meaningful process that has been done to ensure that the Rohingyas that fled um, from Myanmar to Bangladesh have significantly gone back to their places of origin. So, using the same protracted crisis diagram that I made, um, obviously the conflict is internal. That's one. But what do you think is the institutional enabler? And if you want to comment, I'm seeing three comments. You can shoot in who could be the institutional enabler um, for the crisis in Myanmar. Wild guess would be they're carrying arms. So yeah, it's the army. So the institutional enabler in this case is the Tatmadaw, or the military government. But also, in a sense, it's also the civilian government as well, the NLD. Um, in a sense that the way they've lengthened the resolution of the crisis is through inaction. So it's not that they're doing anything significant to dissuade the army from conducting illegal, or what you would consider as excessive forces of clearing operations that may be targeted against ethnic minorities. It's also that they haven't really done anything concrete to dissuade them. So you have a military that's been given a blank check to clear the violence using the argument of an insurgency, but you also have a civilian government that doesn't seem to hold them that much to account. So you have that uh, sort of passe attitude between a democratic elected government not holding their own army to account. So that's an institutional enabler. It it basically, creates that cycle of violence wherein there's no line that's being drawn. Um, Community enabler. This is really interesting because, as what I said in the slide a while ago, as early as 2012, there's already been prevailing uh, hatred against the Rohingya. Um, and I would say, as somebody who's been there and has worked in Rakhine, a lot of the discourse that's happened in the international community is not entirely accurate. in a sense that some of the disagreements. I hope I'm not coded on this, but this is obviously arguable. You can look at different scholarly works, but to some extent, the origins of the Rohingya as an identity is disputable, right? Um, the whole being able to identify yourself as a Rohingya only came up as a contemporary identifier. Many of them call themselves different ways, and the way the local community has used this argument is to say that we're not being listened to, or our side of the story is not being listened to, therefore our violence is just right, or the way we discriminate on these individuals is just right. It's not to say that I'm saying that their violence is right, but I'm giving rationale behind the question of why are these people, or why do some of them irrationally hate on a minority. And in many cases, you will understand that the enabler there is also because the the other side feels like they were never listened to, or their narratives were never factored in. We only, as the world only looks at the plight of of the Rohingya, we tend to gloss over the plight of other ethnic minorities as well. You know, people within Rakhine State are not necessarily Burmese of ethnicity. They also belong to a different ethnic group, which are the Arakanese, or people of Rakhine, and they form part and parcel of the problem that enabled for violence against the Rohingya, but at the same time, they also have differences as well. And in the case of the Rohingya crisis, it was more in a sense that they saw the Rohingya as a common enemy because at least they sort of practice the same religion. But it doesn't mean that the dynamics of the community between the Burmese majority was also sitting comfortably with the Rakhine minority within that region. So I think looking at those dynamics for the Myanmar problem is also important to see why this problem doesn't seem to end, because you have um, historical injustices or narratives that are not being factored in, and that's why it's almost impossible for us to imagine a solution wherein everybody agrees we shouldn't commit to violence, but at the same time, how do you reconcile the narratives that are not meeting each other equally, because you have the rest of the world believing that the Rohingya are the only oppressed people in this crisis. I think it's important for us to look at the community factors as well, which leads me to the international support, and I think this is very specific to Myanmar in general, not just to the situation of refugees in Bangladesh, because in Myanmar you still have some IDPs, Rohingya IDPs, that are living in Rakhine. They're isolated. There's around I think around 200,000 of them. And the way the international community has responded to the problem has been to, on one hand, lobby and sort of negotiate with the government, but at the same time sustain the operations of provisional support for the IDPs. And you would say, well, that's good, right? Like, we're helping them, we're not leaving them to starve. That seems really nice. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But on the other hand, you also think that, doesn't this mean that there's no incentive for the institutional environment and the community environment to change, because they can still go on hating the minorities, because anyway the international community is putting food on their table. So in a sense, there are questions of complicity that have occurred within the international sector, the international aid sector in Myanmar. There's an introspection within the international community saying, is it still right for us to be there and to provide the support, but at the same time make ourselves believe that through quiet, soft negotiation, we can make governments slowly see the error in their ways and find means to work with. I think it's important to see what is the solution that the international community provides for in a crisis. How is it solving it? Or in this case, how is it not solving it? Or more importantly, how is it prolonging the conflict? Because there's no incentive for the situation to change. It's only going to get worse and worse. Which makes me move on to the 13th slide. Just figures, I guess. you're looking at, to this date, 855,000 Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. So I guess at some point in time, the Rohingya were numbered at a million in Myanmar, but only 200,000 of them are left in Rakhine. The rest, like I guess 80%, are now in Bangladesh. That's a huge number. That is a really really big number. And as a I guess as a tidbit, one of the camps in Bangladesh that I've seen, Kutupalong, eh, in Cox's Bazar, is the world's largest refugee camp because it houses 700,000 people. That's massive, in a sense. So I guess we can talk about numbers. We can talk about how glaring these figures are. Uh, but I want to sort of dissect this impact even further. What do these numbers represent? What do 855,000 people really figure? It seems like a very big number, but what does it mean? And I think when you're looking at this from a problem point of view, you look at it from uh, many things, but from my point of view, I guess a few questions, right? What's the impact on our resources, on the international community's resources? It's a huge strain on resources because being able to provide for these individuals who are not able to get jobs, the refugees and IDPs, they're locked in their situation. They're not able to go out and fend for themselves. They rely on doleouts from either governments that are willing enough to take care of them, or in many cases, the international aid environment that gives them relief. So it's a huge strain on resources feeding 855,000 people that have no other option. That's really big. Perpetual state of statelessness causing generations of disenfranchised communities. That's another impact. For the 855,000 Rohingya refugees that are in Bangladesh right now, you're not just looking at the current population, you're looking at a generation that will not see formal schooling, a generation that will not see access to services, a generation that will not see access to healthcare, a generation that will not be able to integrate with other people that are not from their ethnicity or from their group because they are also trapped. And refugees live a very controlled life and environment. They are not able to go out of camps because obviously host governments want to be able to also make sure that they don't just slip in and disappear within their country. So you have a very controlled life, and you see kids growing up as early as 8, as 9, or kids that are being born in these camps without the realistic um, future of seeing whether or not they're going to see something else in the next 10 years or even 12 years. So this is really I guess if you want to look at it from a debate point of view, look at the generational impacts of protracted crisis, not just the violence that we see right now, but also the violence that extends further to other generations, and that's something that's really interesting to look at. Also, when you look at disenfranchised communities, you look at extensions of links to vulnerability, wherein if you have somebody who has very little education, very little options, what do they become? They also become very vulnerable. They become vulnerable to criminal elements, as what we've heard in the press conference. If somebody's hungry, um, they will be forced to take drastic measures. So it's something that we need to factor in when it comes to disenfranchisement, and especially on protracted crisis. The longer they stay in that form of statelessness, the more they're prone to being attracted to criminality, and for good reasons, right? Like being able to put food on your table, that is one fundamental human right that must be addressed. They can also be trafficked, in a sense that they can be easily bought into slavery, shipped out to other countries, and put into years of servitude. These are people who have zero options. What's a boat ride to Malaysia, for example, illegally? What is a 10-hour ride in a container? to end up in a place that at least I get relative freedom. Sure, I'm a slave, but at least I'm out. All these things factored in. It's a situation that's really hard to digest, but that is the exposure that these people get. And lastly, under this link, is being prone to recruitment for extremism. In the case of the Rohingya, you have a militant insurgent group that is very violent. Make no mistake about it. The Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army is a very violent group, but they can get recruits from the disenfranchised population because these people will have no other option. Like, it's either I stay here or I take up arms. That is another factor to consider. Which means that there's a complexity in the possible solutions that can be made for the international community. I'm not here to be a prophet of what can be the full breadth of solution. I don't think any of these two case studies has one single solution. My realization is that you can't just throw money at it to solve the problem. Even if we say the international community dumps like billions of dollars um, towards this, I think there are a lot of tiers of problems that needs to be addressed, and you only need to look at the simple diagram of the institutional enablers, the community enablers. Unless those are solved, the support that the international community can give can only do so much. And in fact, in the case of Myanmar, you can argue that it can even lengthen the conflict unnecessarily because there's no incentive for them to change. Um, which I guess makes me move on to the final bit. Um, Motion analysis. Um, I will try my best. I haven't really debated for quite some time, so I just picked up motions that I thought were really interesting. Also, because I saw this live and I felt very strongly about it. I think this is a really good motion from 2015 Worlds. This house believes that humanitarian organizations should be allowed to give funding, resources, or services to illegal armed groups when this is made a condition for access to vulnerable civilians. Um, what is the case study that I would look at from this? I think I would look at the South Sudan case study, um, wherein some territories in South Sudan are not controlled by government but are controlled by opposition groups. And say you are the ICRC or you are World Vision, one of the most prominent faith-based and international NGOs, going to that area, and you have individuals there that really need your resource, but the warlord in that area demands for you to give a little bit of help for his soldiers as well. And I think that's an interesting ethnic that's an interesting ethical dynamic because it puts you in a position to think, okay, I have a mandate to help people, but at the same time I also need to be wary that I may sort of be a party in the extension of this conflict. Because looking at the lens of a protracted crisis, if that force, that opposition force in a specific um, village lost their resources and are unable to feed their troops, right, with food, doesn't it mean that it's far easier for the government to be able to defeat them? But on one hand, is it in my interest for the government to win this war? But on the other hand, if I don't make the government win this war, then I'll probably extend the war even further. So you see the dilemma, and I think that's a really interesting dilemma from a purely uh, debate standpoint because it puts you in so many different lenses. So that's one thing. The other thing is I think, aside from looking at the concepts of humanitarian principles, what is my mandate, how do I play myself as part and parcel of this war, you also need to look at the human impacts, as what we discussed in the few case studies. What really is the most important thing? Is it my burden as an international NGO to solve the world's problems, or is it just my job to address the immediate short-term needs? Like, I don't have any means within me to save this situation right now. I can't make the two presidents like each other overnight. Might as well be able to save a starving child, right? So that's also a very compelling argument to make, or a compelling perspective make as well. Um, so if I sort of break down my thought process in this, um, I would say first start off with the question: should humanitarian aid be conditional in cases of conflicts? Right? Because obviously the conditionality of humanitarian aid only becomes a conversation of debate if it's a crisis environment, if it's a conflict environment, because that's the only time it can be politicized. It's the only time it can be rational for us to think of maybe I should make conditions to extend this because also don't want to enable a regime from ignoring the needs of their civilian population. Um, the second thing I would ask myself is, what should be the position of aid organizations, both service providers, meaning organizations that provide assistance, but also donors like agencies like the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID, or DFID, the Department of uh, Foreign International Development. Yeah, DFID, or UKAID before, as they were named. Um, how do they see themselves? What is their position? Um, because on one hand, from the perspective of a service provider, I can make the argument that yes, my only mandate is to really look at the immediate needs of the starving population. I don't have any, you know, participation in the political solutions, so I don't think I can do anything about that. But from a donor perspective, right? From from organizations that have the ability to put money and direct policies and influence governments, how should aid be positioned? So it's two very very different conversations, and I think looking at either of those lenses can put you in a very strong position. If I'm on government side that wants to argue, you know, um, unlimited access, even in cases wherein I may be complicit to some extent, I would look at it purely from a service provider point of view. That very specific special mandate, which is addressing the immediate needs. But if I'm on the opposition, I want to look at it from the perspective of the donor community. A community that has far more influence, far more reaching political implications, being able to leverage aid to steer countries to a certain direction. Maybe not to an extent where you make it as conditional as possible, but you can force concessions. You have that ability because you are using your power of assistance. So yeah, is it responding to needs or is it addressing root causes? I think that is a compelling discussion in this particular debate. And obviously, what kind of impact does humanitarian aid have in a crisis? So think of the short term and the long term in this case. Short term is obviously the the immediate human needs, right? People that are dying, all the figures that I pointed out a while ago. But long term needs is also looking at the crisis in itself. How much more can we afford to make this last 3 years more or 4 years more? Or worst case 5 years more. A lot of the crises that we're seeing right now, it is not going to be a surprise to see them reach 10 years. Like 10 years of civil war is the new normal. That is the average age of civil wars these days. And that's really bad because, as what I said a while ago, you see generations being affected, not just immediate populations being affected. And I think at the end of the day, regardless of which side you are on this particular point of interest, you have to prioritize human consequences. I think from my perspective, the the important bit in these debates are really to look at the humanity that is at stake. And there's no clear and cut position that wins. I think it's fair play to say both factor in human consequences, but I would like debaters to focus on the human elements of this. It's not about nation interest. Yes, that's part of it. Western hegemony, or in many cases, Western policies of democracy. Yes, that can be part of it. But I think the most important bit is really the impacts it has to populations that are affected by protracted crisis, and I think that's the most important bit. Another bit is another um, case study motion that I gave out. Uh, this house believes that the international aid community should make humanitarian aid conditional to Myanmar until it takes steps to restore citizenship to the Rohingya. I guess it's the same motion, But what I tried to do was to make it more explicit. So it's still conditionality of aid. It's not um, as shocking uh, as giving to illegal armed groups, but it's the same rationale. So if you want to ground that discussion even further, you can use the second motion as like a grounding for what it could actually look like on the ground, right? Making the international aid conditional on the premise that Myanmar will restore citizenship to the Rohingya. There are lots of far-reaching consequences on that. It means that they're no longer going to be IDPs. You know, they'll be able to free mobility, being able to vote, being able to participate in the civic process of nation building. Uh, but on the one hand, what if Myanmar doesn't agree or makes it harder for us to reach that concession? Is the international aid community willing to bite the bullet and say, okay, then we will ignore or we will accept this as a fair trade off? We won't be able to help people in refugee camps. We won't be able to help people in IDP camps. And that's not a very easy negotiation to make because these are not just 200,000 people. These are people. Every one of them is as important. So having them face the dilemma of uncertainty that they won't be able to have food on their table, they won't have water needs being addressed, hygiene needs being addressed, health needs being addressed, is that something that the international aid community should make a position at because it thinks that the long-term goals are far more important, or we've reached a crucible in the in that situation that we need to make that hard um, bargain in many ways. So I would like to end on the 17th slide, just in general, saying that insofar as conflicts and protracted conflicts are concerned, protracted crises are concerned. To this date, we have 70.8 million people worldwide that have been forced to flee their homes as a result of conflict, persecution, and violence. And that's a huge amount. That is basically the size, more than the size of many nations around the world. And the way this new normal of conflict is evolving means that we need to have more solutions that are not just throwing money on the problem, but also not just about immediate needs, but also looking at the long term consequences. Because I think to some extent, a lot of the world solutions are really very short term right now. Like we're only focused on that, where we're ignoring the concepts of generational justice or being able to address um, prolonged displacement and how that affects individuals and makes them more vulnerable. Um, on slide 18, you can see additional reading materials that you want if you want to get into this even further. I've just basically brought up three websites that you want to read up on. I think it's really interesting to read up on that. And I would like to end this lecture with a quote from my favorite author, J.R.R. Tolkien, from The Two Towers. Uh, it basically just says that wars in the past were fought on noble ends, um, and it's not because there's glory in battle, but because it's because there there's something worth defending for. And to some extent, some of the conflicts that we see right now, you kind of have to ask yourself: Are they still worth? Are the armies that are fighting them, are they defending anything worth something? I think that's something that worth thinking about. So yeah, I guess that ends my lecture. I'm ending at a minute and 8. I don't know what to do next. Am I supposed to have like a Q&A or something? I'm gonna Adrian, do I have a Q&A if you're listening? Do I have a Q&A? Ah, yeah, that's an interesting question. How do I evaluate the role of the UN peacekeepers in reducing conflict? Um, I think so. This is just my point of view, right? Very caveat, like don't quote me on this, even if this is a live stream. Uh, you can look at peacekeeping in two ways. You can look at it in a way that it solves crisis, which is the, I would say, the way it wants it to be projected in many in many ways. Like, you are sending troops. Um, but the reality, I guess, in the way I see it, is that they mostly just act as buffers. And that's not to say that it's a bad thing, right? In some of the most effective peacekeeping forces that I have had the privilege of working with, they are really good at their job of getting in between violent groups. So I could give you for example, and you can even read up on them a bit more. In a contested territory between Sudan and South Sudan, which is Abyei, you have the UNISFA peacekeeping mission. They are really good at what they do because they got in to guard the civilians. They put themselves at the forefront of acting as a buffer between the formal armies of Sudan and South Sudan, and they want to maintain the peace within that region. So I would say peacekeepers are good in not making the conflicts as bad as they could be if they are really good. And I guess that's also a summary of the UN's role as well during crises and emergencies. I'm not gonna go into the extent that the UN always is a panacea to conflicts and emergencies. I think even they themselves are sober enough to know that as an institution, they just make it less worse than what it could be. So in a situation where they're not there, it could be far more worse. Uh, but anybody who props up peacekeepers as a solution to a problem, I think you would have to think twice about them and um, and flag them right away and say that's not a that's not gonna work out. I think they're good at buffers. They're really good at when they work to reduce violence, but they can't solve violence. I don't think there's any mandate to solve violence, like, unless it's like a demobilization effort. Any other question? That was a good question. I think that threw me off a little bit, but it's good. You're welcome. I wish I could talk about IR as theories, but I'm not in the expertise to do that. You probably should invite, like, I don't know, an IR expert to talk about, like, theories that you look at. But I hope that was still informative. Okay, that's interesting. In motions about conflict, what are the strategies teams can employ to justify that international interventions is necessary, especially if the state in conflict has historical experiences of colonialism? Hmm. Okay, if we are to establish democracy in an authoritarian state. Right, that's interesting. Um, what are the strategies that teams can employ? Well, I guess I could still use the same logic that I used on the slide, which is I would look at it first in understanding the factors that enable the oppression, because obviously you can't propose an intervention um, if you're not able to assail the two enablers of violence. I'm not saying that that is a cut and dry thing to do all the time, but if you're able to isolate the institutional factors of violence, and you're able to also isolate the community factors of violence, and you add in the international support via intervention and say this is a solution to address those, then you could have a case, right? Like, you could make a very strategic move to say there's no other force that can make this, because the force of liberation will never come from within, because they're either going to be party to the conflict, or they're just too political to be a credible force. And in that sense, I think it also addresses concepts of colonialism and histories of colonialism, because it's not always the case that colonial powers are always bad. I mean, look, I'm not saying that colonialism is good. I think it is bad. It's a historical tragedy that we have to accept. But for all their worth and for who they are, most of Western governments are still accountable to an extent. So you could rely on them to, in many ways, agree to abide by the Geneva Conventions. They're not going to go mass murder a population, so they're far better off than the ragtag rebel groups that you might be supporting. Um, so I guess in a sense you have to portray the international intervening force as the most credible force, not just because of capability. I think that's a mistake teams make. We're only focused on, or that's a mistake that most people make as casual observers. We're only focused on arms race, like the capacity to wage war. But a lot of wars are won also by reception and by communities seeing that force as a welcome force of intervention. If they don't see that, then they're not going to reciprocate properly to the intervening force. So you need to you need to take a solution that will be less likely to divide rather than unite the problem. I guess an example would be in in the Gambia, right? Where an ECOWAS, which is you could say as an intervening force, intervened um, against Yahya Jammeh that time and forced him to give up power. Um, it's a foreign group. It's not from the Gambia. It's formed of out of a coalition of governments. Um, that was a neutral force that had credibility. So it's always not a bad thing to cite international intervention. I guess the question is, what is the force that you want to use? And I think it's really crucial to identify the composition of that force. How does China's rise as an economic power influence how international arbitration of conflicts are handled? Will this make a difference in how international organizations are structured? That is a good question. Do you want to talk about the WHO? I'm kidding. I think so. So you could read up on this a bit more. I don't think I have the time to explain this even for 1 hour. But China has a very particular interest right now on United Nations peacekeeping. You have to read up on that. They are trying to crowd up all the former positions, high positions within the UN bureaucracy when it comes to peacekeeping. They're investing a lot of resources on having leadership role on peacekeeping, and I think that's a good thing and a bad thing. Um, it's also because of the West or the United States specifically retreating from those obligations of leadership. So you have an opportunity for China to step in. How they are as a peacekeeping actor, it's different from how they are as international players. Say, the West Philippine Sea, for example, um, because they're different in the sense that they have a different agenda. But I also won't go to the extent saying that it's they're any more different if their cards are on the if it's really about protecting the interest and image of the party, then obviously they're probably going to be reactive that way. But peacekeeping leadership from China is not necessarily a bad thing. um, they are very committed in injecting resources um, for them. I guess the way they influence arbitration is my guess is as good as yours. You know, how much how much positions do they have on those groups? So in the case of the World Health Organization, you don't have to do a full on forensic, but you can just research on how much China is investing on the WHO or how much the United States has retreated investments on the WHO, and why the WHO works in a specific extent, why their motivations are like that, why are they afraid to mention Taiwan, for example. And that I think has a similar effect on other international groups or groups of arbitration. But fortunately, I don't think any of the UN bodies have or that form arbitration are have China online. But peacekeeping though, keep an eye on that. It's an interesting trend to look at. They do want a much larger role in peacekeeping, and I think you have to dig up the the motives behind that. What's a good take on motions favoring the establishment of military power on strictly non-military economic blocs like ASEAN or EU? Ooh, well, I guess I'm just throwing ideas that are not my expertise, but I think I have something to say about them because I read up on them. Um, Well, you could argue that for the EU, I guess the fact that NATO isn't as I mean, there's always arguments for standing armies, right? Standing armies are, if you compare them to a peacekeeping army is a voluntary force. The composition is multi-ethnic. It needs governments to surrender or to voluntarily deploy portions of their command under a UN command force. That's a peacekeeping force. And their mandate is very strict. Their mandate is only confined on peacekeeping. There have been situations in the world wherein they've been allowed to engage in combat, but even in their engagement of combat, such as in Sierra Leone, for example, they had a very specific task, to guard foreign civilians, for example. So they don't have the same kind of liberty as a standing army. So in contrast, a standing army is flexible. You can determine the composition of your army, and don't this isn't a xenophobic argument, but the composition of an army, the ethnic composition of an army, has something to do with their cohesion as well, and them being able to work together just on the basis of language alone. So you can imagine in a peacekeeping situation wherein you have Chinese peacekeepers, you have Japanese peacekeepers, you have the Rwandan battalion, you have the Kenyan regiment. Not all of them could speak English. Like, English isn't the lingua franca of all of them. So it's very hard to have a UN command force instructing all of these people. And you could say, oh, just get translators. But in military environments, every second counts. So having having gaps in cohesion has an effect on the ability of an army to do their job. And in the case, for example, of what I flagged a while ago uh, under Nacho's question, the one of the peacekeeping forces I've had the privilege of working with, which is really good, UNISFA, they were composed of majority of them were Ethiopian soldiers. So that it has something to do with having with having control on the composition. So in the case of ASEAN, I guess you could say a good take would be, we can mobilize them right away. We don't need to have disputes between the Philippines and Vietnam, because obviously both of them have two different positions with how they want to look at the West Philippine Sea. At least with an ASEAN force, the ASEAN general can just instruct the ASEAN Navy to go to the waters and defend there. Whereas if you had a multi army environment, they'll have to squabble with each other. I think that's one take at least. Um, how is the pandemic likely to affect prolonged conflicts in long term? Oh, that is a great question. A great question, but also a sad answer. I would say it is making the situation really worse. Like, you read up on Bangladesh right now, the fact that they are. I mean, we talk about this in Manila, right? Social distancing, and then you compare this to environments in the slum. A large part of the displacement in refugee camps, they're worse off than the slums that we have. At least in the slums, you get to roam around to some extent. But refugee camps are far more worse in social distancing. So it's like a petri dish for virus to 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 cultivate. And the worst thing is that if there's one incident in a camp like Kutu Palong, for example, in Cox's Bazar, that is guaranteed to spread like wildfire. That you're gonna infect not just one block, but a whole host of individuals, and that's really bad. Because it strains on. I mean, the pandemic in itself, like the whole COVID-19 thing, it's already putting a strain on national healthcare systems. How much more voluntary international healthcare systems? Like, that is really bad. Like, I just can't imagine the amount of resources that will be needed to mobilize volunteers, doctors, and nurses to hold on. And these camps already have many of these camps, many of these refugee camps, many of these IDP camps in protracted environments already have pre-existing conditions of health vulnerabilities. Some of them already have existing pneumonia, you know. Some of them already have existing sickness. cholera, malaria in many extents. Open defecation is a big problem in the camps that I visited in 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 Rakhine. Because they don't have proper toilets, or they're not really keen on pooping on toilets. So you can imagine how much of a weight the pandemic is. But thanks for asking that question. I think it's worth thinking that there are a lot more people that are going to be facing far more worse problems than we are, despite the boredom of not being able to go out. Um, do we still have time for more questions, or that it? Thanks for the questions, everyone. Um, just gonna wait for Adrian to say the session has ended, because I have to end. Do I end stream now? Sorry, I'm taking up some air time. Dead air. This is supposed to be bad for live streaming. Okay, right. I guess that's my cue. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you learned something. Uh, Slides are there. It's not very useful to some extent, but I tried my best to make it as informative as possible. Good luck in future tournaments. Stay at home. Let's help flatten the curve and help each other. Stay safe. Goodbye.